This week, we're going to be discussing two American authors, Washington Irving and Edgar Allan Poe. Both wrote what is known as Gothic fiction, or horror, or Gothic horror, which is a branch off from Romantic literature. You'll recall that the Romantic writers in England and America in the 19th century were interested in writings that evoked the past, that evoked nature, and also in the figure of the solitary, lonely, romantic hero who bucks the traditions of society and goes his own way. Well, there was one more thing that interested the Romantics, and that is the supernatural. Gothic fiction tended to dwell on the supernatural and on horror, and it dwelt on the idea of the present being haunted by the past in various ways. It would sometimes, but not always, take place in a setting that was evocative of the past, such as an old castle or a churchyard, or maybe in some crypts or faraway backwater villages. Anywhere that was well removed from modern industrialized society. Again, there's that romantic push toward getting away from the modern, getting away from the technology of current civilization and going back to a more simpler time. One thing that distinguishes the Gothic fiction from some of the supernatural horror stories or films that we might watch today is that these writers were seldom interested in thrills merely for the sake of thrills. Most of their stories utilized the supernatural and the horrors in order to metaphorically explore psychological issues or social issues of the day. It's a genre that certainly had its detractors. It was seen by other writers as something of a low culture or pop culture type of production. But most of the great writers of the time borrowed elements from the genre, and some even contributed to it substantially. Charles Dickens, the Bronte sisters, and Oscar Wilde all took cues from the Gothic writers of their day and of the generations immediately preceding them. So, Washington Irving, our first writer, was born in 1783 in Manhattan, on the same week, actually, that the American Revolution came to an end. He was named after George Washington, who would be an important person for Irving throughout his career. When he was 6, he actually met the first president when he was living in New York after his inauguration. And later on in his life, Irving would write a 5-volume biography on the life of George Washington, having visited Mount Vernon and researched into the president's friends and acquaintances and really just explored Washington's life. Irving was a very public figure. In addition to being a writer, he was also involved in the political world of the time. He served in the War of 1812, served on the staff of the American minister to London in the 1830s, and was himself appointed as minister to Spain in 1842 by President John Tyler. And that was an appointment that he doesn't appear to have enjoyed. The political realm in Spain at the time was a bit chaotic. The Queen was 12 years old, and there were several different factions trying to control her. But Irving did his best to navigate through the confusion and remain on cordial terms with everyone. But it was exhausting, and it left him a little time in which to write, which he enjoyed doing and which he was very successful in doing. By the end of his life, he was already well known as a great American author that other up-and-coming writers could look up to and turn to for advice. He was seen as having perfected the genre of the short story, as well as having contributed to the cause of protecting authors from copyright infringement. At the time, there was really no punishment on the books for bootlegging another author's work, and Irving fought to remedy that all throughout his career, not just for himself, but for these other up-and-coming writers that he had sort of taken under his wing. Our other writer, Edgar Allan Poe, was less famous in his own day, though he did manage to make a career by his writing alone, which he was one of the first to do so. He was born in 1809 in Boston to parents who were actors. When his mother died and his father abandoned him, he was taken in by a successful merchant family in Virginia, the Allens, and though they never formally adopted him, they did give him their last name. That's why he's Edgar Allan Poe, not just Edgar Poe. Poe spent some time studying at the University of Virginia, but eventually had to drop out due to a lack of money and a gambling problem that he had developed there. He then joined the military and sought his discharge after 2 years' service, and after that he started to make a living from his writings, short stories, poems, and works of literary criticism and reviews. He wrote a lot of reviews of other writers for different magazines at the time. He's known for several odd things, which we won't have time to get into here, but I do want to touch on one or two of them. When he was 27, he married his cousin, Virginia Clem, who was 13 at the time. And this appears to have been done with the family's permission, and they appear to have had a rather loving marriage while it lasted. But unfortunately, Virginia died from tuberculosis after battling the disease for 5 long years. She died at 24, and in his grief for her, Poe wrote some of what is now known as his best poetry, including Annabel Lee and The Raven. The Raven is probably the most famous thing that Poe has written. You've likely either read it before or heard it recited before, or at least know what it's about. The bird's famous call of nevermore in response to every question that the narrator asks it. Poe's own death is a circumstance shrouded in mystery. He was found wandering on the streets one night, wearing clothes that weren't his own, and mumbling, "Lord help my poor soul." He was taken to a hospital, but passed that night on October 7th in 1849. And his cause of death remains a mystery, though alcohol may have played a large part in it. But people debate to what extent he had been drinking that night, whether or not he had been attacked, what exactly happened there. We don't know. Poe was just beginning to experience some literary fame before his death, and after his passing, his work really took off. So, I asked you to read several of both Irving and Poe's short stories, which are illustrative of their own particular styles, and which also highlight how both writers were working within the Romantic tradition of literature that they inherited from England. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow is maybe one of Irving's best-known works. In the story, he plays off the tradition of Romantic literature, while at the same time Americanizing it. Tarrytown and Sleepy Hollow are real places in upstate New York, so he's giving us a slice of American life in a way that even someone like Herman Melville didn't do for his audience. Melville's stories, for the most part, took place out on the high seas, or in exotic locations. Washington Irving was one of the first writers to situate his stories in contemporary America, and many others followed his example, which makes him one of the more important and influential American writers of the period. His description of the inhabitants of Sleepy Hollow, however, is very indebted to the Romantic writers. He compares them to still pools of water beside the rushing current of a river, saying that while all the rest of the world is in a hustle and a bustle, Sleepy Hollow is, well, sleepy. Progress doesn't seem to have advanced there much. The Dutch settlers are living a rural lifestyle, and they hold to all sorts of superstitions and ghost stories that other people would probably mock at. We meet the protagonist of the story, Ichabod Crane, and get an idea of what sort of person he's like. Kind of odd, a little bit of a mixed bag. His only real passion seems to be for going to dinners and stocking up on food and goods. Even his romantic life is touched with this desire. One of the main reasons that he's courting the girl in the story is because he wants to be the master of her father's farmland and all of the sustenance it provides. But the girl has another admirer as well, and this leads to the main scene of the story. One night, Ichabod is coming home from a gathering at the girl's house, and he's chased by the most fearsome of the local legends, the Headless Horseman. He even sees that the horseman appears to be carrying his own head in his saddle as he gives chase, although of course he can't get too good of a look at it, because he's running from him at the time. The figure eventually does catch up to Ichabod, and he throws his own head at the man, knocking him down off of his horse. And here's where things get interesting. Irving never tells us in plain words what happened, but he leaves us to infer or guess at what follows next. The next day, Ichabod Crane is gone. The locals immediately add his name to the list of the horseman's supposed victims, and the legend continues to grow. But did something supernatural really happen? We're told that a smashed pumpkin is found at the scene where Ichabod was knocked off of his horse. We're also told that in later years, someone who looked suspiciously like Ichabod ended up running for a political office in another town. So was this all just some sort of prank by the other suitor? Was Ichabod so terrified or embarrassed that he just left town without saying anything to anyone? From the details that the story gives us, we're certainly free to believe that. Maybe we're even being led to believe that. But the real thrill, the real terror of the story comes from supposing Ichabod to have actually been chased by a headless horseman. This is a ghost story. It's famously told on Halloween nights. But Irving leaves it a bit of a mystery as to just how supernatural this tale really is. As readers, we have an out, or a justification for the things that we read about. A rational, logical justification. But Irving doesn't confirm this justification, he merely hints at it. To bring a bit of mystery into his stories, Edgar Allan Poe, on the other hand, liked to utilize the idea of an unreliable narrator. We've talked about how a story's point of view or perspective of narration is important, and this is a prime example, because people in Poe's stories are addressing the reader directly from a first-person perspective, and we're only getting the unfolding narrative from their point of view, and their point of view seems skewered. The narrator in The Telltale Heart assures us that he isn't mad. He assures us over and over again that no madman could have behaved so cunningly or so wisely as he did. But, then again, as he tells us what he's done, we're left off with kind of the impression that he is, in fact, mad. His motivation for killing the old man doesn't strike us as sufficient or even logical. He's bothered by the old man's eye. He seems to have fixated on that one particular eye to the point where it's driven him crazy. And then, at the end, we're left again with something of a mystery when the beating of the old man's heart gets louder and louder beneath the floorboards, to the point where the narrator feels certain that everyone else in the room can hear it too, and so he confesses, convinced that everyone else is mocking him by pretending not to hear. But what really happened here? Did the severed, trampled heart actually begin to beat? We might expect something like that to happen in a supernatural tale, of course. Or was the narrator driven even more mad by his own guilty conscience, and he just thought that he heard the heart beating? Because he's so unreliable as a storyteller, we can't say. We're left with questions, and the story can be read either way. Montresor in The Cask of Amontillado assures us that what he's about to do is just. His victim has what's coming to him. He says that he suffered 1,000 injuries at the hand of his victim, and that his family has too. But he doesn't really explain what those injuries were. We have to rely on him that they actually exist, but he's not a very reliable guy. After all, the story is about him burying someone alive, essentially. So is Montresor just as mad as the narrator of The Telltale Heart? Does he have a legitimate grievance? We don't know. Poe was a master at writing stories with unreliable narrators. All that we as the readers are allowed to see is what the narrator sees. And Poe knows that sometimes the things we see are distorted by our own passions, our own blindnesses, or our own madness. Another thing that I think all of the protagonists in Poe's stories have in common is this. They're all possessed with an overweening amount of hubris. I think we've discussed this before, but hubris is a Greek word, which comes out of discussions of Greek tragedy, which means having excessive or unbounded pride. Usually in a story, a character's hubris will lead to their downfall. Pride goeth before a fall, after all, as the scriptures say. In The Telltale Heart, we see the narrator gloating over the fact that he thinks he's gotten away with murder. When the police come to investigate, he actually invites them to stay longer to chat. And then, in an even greater flourish, he puts his own chair right over the floorboards where the old man's body is hidden, and he proceeds to laugh and chatter away. But of course, this all eventually contributes to his eventual downfall, which we've already discussed. In The Mask of the Red Death, we see Prince Prospero literally laughing in the face of death. He decides to throw this huge party while some sort of horrible sickness or plague is running rampant throughout the country. He thinks that he's secured in his palace, and because he feels so secure, he invites all of his well-to-do friends over to laugh and to party and to drink while the rest of the country suffers. But little does he know that he can't keep death out forever. Death is there in the party with them, and they only find out once it's too late. We don't really get to see Montresor's hubris lead him to any downfall. Part of the horror of that story is that he seems to get away with his crimes, but he certainly possesses hubris, and he gloats over the crime that he's committing in a similar way that the narrator of The Telltale Heart does. He lures Fortunato down into his family vaults underneath the city by playing off of Fortunato's drunkenness and vanity. He offers Fortunato every chance to turn back, playing with him like a cat with a mouse. And so Edgar Allan Poe likes to get us inside of the head of these sometimes despicable, sometimes disturbed characters, because he likes to explore the darkness of the human heart. Not that he glorifies it, not that he thinks it's a good thing, but he seems to be riding under the impression that we all have a bit of a monster inside of us, and that it's good to study that in order to be more aware of it. In order to maybe check ourselves when we find ourselves expressing thoughts or ideas similar to his madmen and his killers and his unreliable narrators. So both are important authors in their own times and in our own day. Both contributed to the American literary tradition. Both really helped to perfect the short story. Edgar Allan Poe actually helped to develop the detective story as well. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle had written the Sherlock Holmes stories in England, but Edgar Allan Poe wrote a good amount of detective fiction too, that contributed to that genre taking off in later years. So that will be it for this week's lecture, and thank you for watching.